Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Priyanka Venkat back to the program. Priyanka, we've had you on here before, but I know for a fact there are some people who are meeting you for the very first time. Would you take a moment to tell us just a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. So, as you heard, my name is Priyanka Venkat. I'm a researcher in Washington, D.C., and my writing mainly focuses on issues of local governance. And today we're talking a little bit about higher ed and how local governance and shared governance impacts those structures.
I'm looking at the headline of your Washington Examiner article, and it says Professors Get Short End of the Stick in Virginia Collective Bargaining Push. And, I guess I've had it in my mind. Once you get to where you're a professor, you're probably tenured, and, it seems like you would be about as secure as you could get. Talk to me a little bit about what kind of collective bargaining was going on, and how exactly did these professors come out somewhat on the losing end?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's no secret that higher education has felt some tumultuous times over the past few years, and Virginia in particular has had a slew of administrative overreach into these sort of governing systems of higher education. Like in 2025, my alma mater in particular, George Mason University, was not only did we have a change in the Board of Trustees, but also we had a federal probe by the Department of Justice into George Mason University. And while I am sympathetic to the idea of changing higher education and making it so it's more focused on different programs or in creating more value for higher education for students. The issue comes with a series of decisions that have centralized decision making in higher education. And what that means is that professors are losing this ability to govern over not only their curriculum, but also in their decision making. They're being limited through academic and administrative overreach. And what that means is a professor might have a cushy job, but when admin comes in, as they did in Virginia State University, and says, "Hey, you have this research grant, you have these great programs that you're trying to run, and you have tenure," actually, no, we're going to call you in for a meeting and we're going to revoke your tenure and revoke your ability to work at this university. So professors have been feeling an onslaught of attacks from administration in higher education, and that's led to some sort of push to try and get some sovereignty back by collectively bargaining. So there was a push in the Virginia General Assembly, and on March 14th, despite a lot of lobbying from groups like the United Campus Workers of Virginia, the bill passed to expand public sector collective bargaining, but did not include higher education professors and some
And
other
your
groups as
article,
well.
you give some examples. Librarians, firefighters, home care professionals, they were all included. So I have to ask, why weren't professors in higher education invited to have a place at that table?
So there were a couple key reasons. First of all, any sort of collective bargaining leads to, or in the worst case, can lead to union groups getting exclusive rights. And in higher education, what that means is professors, their salaries, especially tenured salaries, make up a large portion of the university budget, getting to like it's a very nice cushy job to have tenure. So expanding a lot of these collective bargaining rights towards professors could lead to, I think one administrator said to me, more than $10 million of sort of these out of expenses for the state to cover. And the other reason, and why I argue that collective bargaining might not be the best tool for professors to gain sovereignty back, is that by collective bargaining, they lose their ability to be treated as actors in this university shared governance. They're treated not as professional employees, or sorry, they're treated as managerial employees right now, but if they collectively bargain, they'd be treated as professional employees. And under labor law, which gets a little dicey, what that means is professors are essentially giving up their sovereignty to make, or they're admitting that they might not have the decision-making skills that they've continued to lose. So professors, you want them to have the ability to have sovereignty over what they teach, over some department-specific needs. They have the knowledge to do that. And in a shared governance system, these professors likely would be able to advocate for the needs of their department, work with administration. But now they're saying, okay, we're employees and administration, we're only working through a union or to collectively bargain. We're creating this sort of employee contractual relationship, which ruins this presumption of shared governance that universities have functioned on.
Wow. I guess, now this is probably because I don't spend a lot of my time in higher education, but that's not something that I had previously ever considered. Now, and at the risk of sounding like a complete noob to ask this, but when we talk about tenure, I want to make sure that I'm understanding what it means for instance, when we say that a professor has tenure, what does that signify?
So a professor that has tenure, not only it's a long-term, basically lifelong contract. What that means is the university is saying, we enjoy your research, we think that you are an asset, and if we view universities as knowledge-producing institutions, they're betting on sort of the human capital of this professor, that they are going to add knowledge to the world, their scholarship is going to contribute to advancing human knowledge regardless of field. So they award tenure to these professors, and as a bargain, they say, hey, we're going to pay you probably less than what maybe you would get private teaching, all of that, under this assumption of job security. We're going to give you this job security. And tenure also historically has protected a professor from being targeted or damaged from based on what they research and what they say. So it's the tenure serves as a safeguard to this idea of what's called academic freedom. So professors are free, not free to say whatever they want without consequence, but they are protected from repercussions to a certain extent based on what they choose to study. So that means that professors are a lot more free to go against an orthodoxy or have a little bit more freedom in what they decide to research, which is good because we don't want a university who's an institution of scholarship to be censored. We don't want our professors to feel censored. But a lot of higher education decisions, especially in Virginia, have left professors feeling on very shaky foundations, based and collective bargaining only sort of further removes their sovereignty to like advocate for themselves. So I understand that as tenure protections may be weakening, these professors are looking to maybe unionizing, getting some of that sovereignty back, but they forget that the trade-off for that is that they lose their ability to make decision making on an administrative level because now they're just professionals. They're not they don't get any managerial sort of responsibilities.
That was a wonderful explanation, by the way. I feel better for us having had this conversation because now I feel like, oh, finally, I'm starting to understand that. Um, Talk to me about what changed though within the collective or within the academic arena. The professors are losing some of that authority. Is that coming from within academia itself, or is it outside influences that are diminishing some of their standing?
It's a little bit of both, and higher education is very tricky because it involves so many competing factors. Professors, I just spoke, I gave a soliloquy towards academic freedom and why it should be protected, but professors sometimes, especially uh, in fields where there might be more of an orthodoxy in thought, are targeted inside the academy for speaking out against an orthodoxy. A professor that comes to mind, maybe Dr. Eric Smith, who has a wonderful essay on why he left academia and his field of rhetoric and composition. So there's an internal struggle where professors are feeling like there's not this spirit of open inquiry internally in the academic spaces in certain fields. And externally, you have administrators coming in and maybe trying to overcorrect for some of this by imposing sort of administrative controls over who the board of trustees are and eroding the faculty knowledge and ability to make decisions on what their curriculum should be. So you have this sort of two-pronged attack on higher education from both the administrative side as well as the internal side. So I can't fault administrators or professors for being concerned on their various interests. But as higher education continues, we have lower declining rates of enrollment. We have pushback against university handling of I think what comes to mind first is the protests in the wake of the October 7th attacks. You have higher education is in this big storm, and it's wearing this litmus test of where it's going to be. But professors, in my view, and what I argue in the op-ed, is that professors benefit more from a system like shared governance than they would from a system like collective bargaining. Because even if there are sort of orthodoxies that within fields, you have this government pushback or governing pushback where it's not everybody. And you even have an opportunity to sort of advocate for yourself and your knowledge as a professor. Like, I never want to assume that there's one person who makes any of these decisions or one professor. So the system that we have as shared governance does work better.
I sure appreciate you coming on the program today. This was really enlightening. Again, we're talking with Priyanka Venkat. She is a Young Voices contributor. And where can people find you on social media so that they can follow you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have an X, so it is at pre_Venkat, and some of my work is also on the Mutual Persuasion Substack.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Hey, we're happy to welcome a new contributor to the show this week. His name is Yaniv Regev. Uh, Yaniv, welcome to the program. I know people are going to first, they're going to want to know, well, who exactly is this guy? Would you mind telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Thanks for having me, by the way. So I'm Yaniv Regev. As the name suggests, I'm originally from Israel, but right now I live in DC, where I attend Georgetown University, and I study democracy and political theory.
All right. I'm looking at an article that you wrote for realclearbooks.com, Pop Culture Populism and Hollywood's Sequel Problem. I know you're going to hit a nerve with this one because there are a lot of us who, we see sequels come out and we're just like, really? Where's all the original content? Talk to me a little bit about set the stage for us. What prompted you to write this article in the first place?
That was a great question. So I was wondering the same thing as you and as many other people. Like, why is it that studios are investing so much in just repeating old classics? We have Toy Story 5, Scream 7. I think we have a new Shrek movie coming up too, and not investing in new classics like the ones that affected us to begin with. And I was wondering about this in the context of what I study, which is primarily populism and democratic backsliding, and I couldn't help but notice a distinct connection between the two. One where both politicians and these CEOs of studios are basically capitulating to mass audiences instead of trying to elevate the palette.
Yeah, I mean, you really touch on something here that I know has been a source of irritation for a lot of people. And I'm not a heavy consumer of what Hollywood's putting out, but when I see a new movie coming up and I'm like, wow, they're just gonna get, I guess this must have made some money, so let's figure out a way we can milk this franchise for a little bit more. Obviously there are some economic concerns, but talk to me from a creative standpoint. Is there a shift that's taken place in Hollywood where it's just easier to go along the storyline of something that's already proven itself rather than try to break new ground?
No, I think you're exactly right. I think these Hollywood studios have figured out that as long as they keep regurgitating the old classics, people will show up because familiarity sells. It's nice to go to a movie and know the sort of the beats, the characters, the concept overall. You don't have to take a risk when you go to a sequel. And yeah, the economics are there for the studios, so they just keep repeating it instead of challenging us. And my concern for me is that art is supposed to challenge people. It's supposed to challenge the status quo, make people rethink some of their assumptions. And when you just do this thing where you just repeat the old classic and different iterations, it doesn't do that. It just placates instead of elevates. And that is my concern there.
That is a really great observation too. And I don't think you're trying to make the case here that, hey, everything we watch in the theater should make us uncomfortable and cause us to question our own existence. But there's a place for that creativity to kind of push us and to explore things we would not have considered otherwise. Whereas, just taking the sequel route is just it's safe and it's comfortable and it's recognizable, but what is it really doing for us?
No, absolutely. I'm a fan of, familiarity and sequels as much as the other guy. I love watching the same movie like three times sometimes. But again, that I'm just concerned about the staggering amount of sequels and remakes. And to me, like it's okay to go to see a movie that's familiar and to just bathe in that familiarity at some from time to time. But when it becomes like 30% of what you're producing, the sacrifice there in quality, the sacrifice on challenge, that is what I'm concerned about. And it's about striking that balance. And I feel like, the Hollywood studios are just taking the easy route out with this one.
You talk about the balance that has to be struck here, and I have respect for whether it's filmmakers or musicians or any other kind of artist who's out there creating something. On the one hand, if you're too avant-garde, people will be like, "Phew, whoa, not ready for that." On the other hand, there's a danger in being too comfortable. Talk to me a little bit about what happens when we lean into complacency.
Yeah, that actually strikes at a quote that I mentioned in my paper from Katy Perry, funnily enough, where she says that you can be too arty and lose your audience, or you can be too charty and lose your art. And I think this is a balance that every artist has to grapple with. On the one hand, there's a reason why certain art forms have made you famous. There's a certain reason why people gravitate towards indie pop music, towards, Inside Out, towards Toy Story, towards the sort of original content. And so you don't want to lose that spark that made you popular in the first place. But you also don't want to capitulate entirely into it and not and fail to, evolve with the times, evolve your own craft and challenge the audience. So you can't be too obscure where you lose the audience, but you can't be too mainstream where you lose the art.
No, that makes sense. And the word inspire comes to mind. And I'm not saying that every, bit of movie watching that we do should somehow be an inspirational experience, but you know, the movies that seem to really rise to the top are the ones that in some way inspire us to either think differently or see things differently or understand at a different level than we did before. Let's liken this, I think you do this well in your article, to what we see. It kind of mirrors something that's happening in politics in terms of populism, where well, I'll just reflect back to you what you already want to hear, and people eat it up.
Exactly, exactly. And that is the issue because these elites, whether these are the elites, CEOs of companies, of like studio companies, or these are just the elites of just, politicians, Washington, D.C. politicians, they have an obligation to raise our expectations. They shouldn't just placate the audience. They shouldn't just try to tell you what you want and just give you what you want. I know that may be a little provocative to say in a democratic society, but I do think that in by virtue of being an elite, you have an obligation to raise the bar, to be above in some regard.
No, I think so. And I know we're touching, primarily on, creative arts and in this case filmmaking, but this could expand to so many other areas of life where advancement doesn't come from people being so comfortable and entrenched that they never ever want to try anything different or new. The world changes when we shift our perspective, even if it's just by a degree or two. Talk to me about who bears responsibility for this? Is it the audience that's willing to buy those tickets for, sequel number 7 or 8 or 9? Or does it fall on the artist who should be aspiring for something higher than just, well, we'll churn out something that's kind of like what we did last time?
Well, that's a great question. I would say that we all have agency. We all can choose whether to go buy, a stuff for Toy Story 5. But I think that I actually think the responsibility mostly lies with the elites here because they're the ones who are choosing to capitulate to the audience's tastes and their palates. And I think familiarity it's natural for us to gravitate towards. In the same way that it's natural for a child to gravitate towards like high fatty foods like McDonald's and KFC. But it is up to the parent, it's up to the elite in this case to direct them to working that is more healthy, more substantial, more inspiring than just what is comforting. And so yeah, it's very Burkean of me, very Edmund Burke of me to say this, but he has this idea of noblesse oblige, where if you are the nobility in your society, you have an obligation to the people to use your position for good, to raise the bar, to elevate taste, and be be almost a public servant in a sense. And so I do, by and large, blame the studios that have kind of just capitulated or abdicated this responsibility.
Okay, one final question for you, and this is primarily for the consumers, whether it be of politics, of art, pop culture, whatever it may be. Um, what is the benefit of learning to, if not enjoy, but at least be willing to be uncomfortable or to push the limits of our comfort zone occasionally?
Yeah, I would just I would just say, think about the first time like you watched Toy Story or a new classic or a TV show. Like it just hits so much harder than when you rewatched it, even if it's nice to rewatch it. It expanded your world a little bit. It made you think about a different dimension or a different way that you've never even thought to think of yourself, yourself of. So like Toy Story, for example, this idea that our toys are just they have a life of their own when we're not looking. And we can just look around, and when we're not looking, they just like come to life and have this secret world. Like as a child, that is kind of like groundbreaking in some ways. And the topics and the themes that Toy Story 1 touched on, the original Toy Story, these are things that we can all relate to and learn from. Buzz replacing Woody, the jealousy, the growing up with Toy Story 3, especially. These are all things that are uniquely human. And when the first time you've heard about them, it's expanded our world a bit. It made us challenge our thinking. And if you just bathe in familiarity all the time, you're not learning anything. You're not growing. You're just, you're getting high off of your own supply. And that's not what art should do. Art should challenge us. Art should make us question our deepest held beliefs. And that's how society moves forward.
I love it. This, you've actually inspired me to maybe put a little more thought into what am I watching if when I go to Netflix or whatever. Again, we're talking with Yaniv Regev. He is a Young Voices contributor. Where can people find you and follow you on social media?
So they can find me on Instagram at Yaniv, that's Yayniv, or on LinkedIn.
Thanks again. Looking forward to our next conversation.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Take care.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We are happy to welcome another new contributor to this week's show. Her name is Jillian Laird. Jillian, welcome to the program. Take a moment, if you would, and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me. So, I'm currently getting my master's degree in English and working on my first ever novel. And the majority of what I talk about is social media. So, I have a presence on YouTube where I have almost 20,000 subscribers, and I post content all about being chronically offline and the benefits of digitally detoxing.
Oh, you got my attention here. Now, I have six kids, and so we've had a lot of conversations in our home about social media and what's appropriate versus, inappropriate use of it and so forth. But you know what? I can't think about some of the guidelines I've tried to set for them without realizing it affects me too. Let's talk about when you mentioned detoxifying from social media. Why do we need to detox from this?
Social media has very much become kind of the modern Pandora's box. I don't think that when it became a major player that people were exactly expecting it to become so toxic. Like I remember when it was first introduced, I was about 10, 11, and my parents let me have it because they didn't expect that it would become what it has. Currently, 51% of teens would like to digitally detox from their social media, but they won't because they have a fear of missing out, because they feel that their entire world lives online. So they struggle to make a life outside of that, hence the rise in anxiety and depression amongst teens. And this is also affecting their school life. So they're struggling to make friends, they're struggling to learn, to read, retain information, think analytically, think critically. So it's very important that we learn to put in place ways to protect our young people, America's youth, the world's youth, from these toxicities. So I recently wrote an article where I listed out 5 ways that parents can specifically remove their children from social media, whether in totality or starting small. And President Trump himself has shown a quote, keen interest in doing so. However, or in implementing a social media ban for teens, very similar to what took place in Australia recently. However, he has not introduced any legislation to get that moving forward. But if that were to take place, some issues could arise, particularly when it comes to our right to free speech. So it really does fall back on the parents. If you want your child offline, it is up to you to get them off and to remember that you have the power to do so.
Wow. And you mentioned President Trump. I know at the federal level there have been people, well, we're going to save the kids from social media. At the state level, that can be seen as well. Let's make the case why parents need to lead out, and let's talk about some of those 5 ways that you mentioned that we can help our kids gain a handle on their social media use.
Right. So several states have actually enacted laws that prohibit schools from allowing cell phone use, Texas being one of the most recent. And, teachers are reporting that students have higher participation, they have less anxiety. But what happens when they go home? Are they retaining what they're learning in school? Because they're going home and they're getting right back on their phone. They're going right back into that world. So again, it really does fall on the parents. So one of my tips is to teach your child that the phone belongs to you, the parent, and not them, which may be hard to implement, especially if you've already given your child a phone, but specifically for parents of younger children who are entering into middle school, high school, they're at that age where, they arguably need a phone to stay in contact with their parents. It's very important to let them know that that device does not belong to them. They are essentially borrowing it from the parent. It's a loaned device. Because if you give a child something and you tell them that it's theirs, and then you go and you try to take it away from them, they are much more likely to feel, obviously, a sense of ownership over that. So if you try to take it, they're going to get angry. They're going to get upset. They're going to fight back. So one of the biggest things, especially for parents who haven't given their kids a phone yet, is to never give it to them with ownership. It belongs to you. Another big one for me is to bring back the alarm clock or just really anything that could be considered analog. In today's day and age, most people use their phone as an alarm to wake up in the morning, which opens the door for scrolling first thing in the morning, scrolling late into the night, especially for teens who have a particular addiction, I would say, to their devices and to social media. They don't want to put it down. And it's the first thing they want to see in the morning. And doing so actually spikes stressors in the brain when that is the first and the last thing that you're looking at every single day. So if you implement the alarm clock back into your house, where that basically means that your child doesn't need to have their phone in their room. So you could set another rule that you can't bring your phone into your room at night. Therefore, they don't have it in the morning. So they're able to wake up naturally, stay more calm, and avoid the stressors, the anxiety spikes, etc.
By the
Another
way,
one,
everything you have mentioned so far applies so well to us as parents and to adults. I just want to say, because I'm prone to the same kind of thing. Wake up in the morning, first thing I want to do. Have I missed anything? Anyway, please continue. What was the third one?
well, it's actually funny that you say that because I do have another one that is to digitally detox yourself. It's very important that children are able to look to role models like their parents because they're looking to them anyway. So if they see their parent constantly scrolling on their phone, whether it's texting and driving or replying to texts or looking at Instagram during a family meal, they are going to learn that behavior and they're going to want to emulate it. And if you try and tell them they can't do that while continuing to do it yourself, you're going to get more resistance. So you have to be that model for your children. And I know it's hard because everyone loves their phone, everyone loves social media. So when you're a parent, you're in a hard place because you kind of almost have to parent yourself at the same time. But the results are so worth it because you essentially will get your own life back, but you'll get your kids back too. But back to what I was originally saying with number three, I was going to say device-free days. So kids, there was actually a study done by Common Sense Media where they took a group of 200 11 to 17-year-olds, and found that they had an average of around 250 notifications pop up on their phone per day. This is what's keeping your child so glued to their phone is this dopamine spike, this excitement as to what is coming up on their phone. Is it a new Instagram notification, a new TikTok? Did their favorite celebrity post something? or their friends texting them. So this is what's keeping them in that loop of wanting to stay on all the time. So if you can implement a device-free day in your household, just one day a week, where everyone puts their phone into a bucket, it will slowly teach your kid that they can survive without their phone for a day. And it will eventually help them to feel more safe and more excited to give their phone up for a day because, like I said, 51% of teens actually want to detox, but they don't because they have a fear of missing out. So if you can show your kid on these digital detox days that there is a life worth living, that they're not missing out on anything, I think that'll be really beneficial for them. And my final tip is to turn off non-essential notifications, which is something that parents can actually do from their own phone. So if you're an Apple user, you can use Apple Screen Time to connect directly to your child's device and turn off those non-essential notifications. You can turn off their Instagram notifications, TikTok, X, whatever it is that they're into. You can also turn off text messages from their friends past a certain time. You can make it to where they only receive texts and phone calls from you, the parent. Obviously, that's up to the parent as to how far they want to take that. But as I was saying, notifications are one of the biggest things that keep kids glued to their phone. Every single time it goes off, they're reaching for it. They're even reaching for it just to check if there's a notification, even if there isn't one or if they didn't hear it go off. So it's very important that these non-essential notifications be turned off.
I love the last line in your article about how the social media cure is found at home, not in the US Capitol. And everything that you have outlined here, I think is absolutely on target and more applicable to adults than I think a lot of us really want to admit. Especially, I loved your take on the uh, device-free days. Now, this has just been my experience. Maybe yours mirrors it too. But when I can set my phone down and be away from it for even 2 days, the world starts looking so much more normal, and there's so much less fear or anxiety about what's going on somewhere else that most often has nothing whatsoever to do with me.
This is very true. I actually first gave up social media around 20 years old, and I was off of it for nearly 4 years. And it was crazy how much my life changed in that time and how much I grew into myself as a young person and regained a lot of independence and identity. And I think that that's something that is very important for young people today in today's society to be able to do. And as parents, I think we can really usher that in for them.
Again, we are visiting with Jillian Laird. She's a young writer or contributor to Young Voices and a young writer from Texas. Where can people find you and how can they follow you on social media?
So I am on LinkedIn, and then my other main social media platform is YouTube. You just look up my name, and there I am, and there's tons of videos all about digital detoxes and being chronically offline.
Wonderful to have you on the show today. Thanks again for being my guest.
Thank you.
Welcome back. This is our fourth and final segment of Moving Forward with Young Voices today. I'm happy to welcome Tyler Turman back to the program. Tyler, great to see you once again. Take a moment and tell us a little bit about yourself for those who are meeting you for the first time.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian. It's an honor to be here with you again. My name is Tyler. I work in public policy research, and my main focus is on welfare, social mobility, and upward mobility and anti-poverty policy. And my most recent article was for National Review on Trump's war on fraud.
This is a great article, by the way. The title is For Trump to Win the War on Fraud, States Must Be Held Accountable. And we have seen some pretty interesting developments in the last couple of months. I mean, Minnesota, now California's in the headlines. And if there's a common pattern that seems to emerge here, and I think it's probably true in other states, it's that federal money somehow feels like a great big freebie, which means there's probably less incentive for those on the receiving end of that federal money to really be careful because it's not like, hey, it's not coming out of my pocket, not even the people in my state. It seems like it's just easier to give away other people's money. Talk to me about how the states need to be held accountable. What's being done right? More importantly, what needs to be done to really make them accountable?
Yes, so you are 100% correct. The common problem that we have in many of our means-tested welfare programs, whether it's the food stamp program or Medicaid or many different programs that we saw in Minnesota, for example, as you mentioned, is that many of these programs are administered by the states, but they're funded almost entirely or largely by federal taxpayers. So with the food stamp program, for example, it's funded more than 90%, upwards of 95% by the federal government. With Medicaid, it's around 70%. And many of the programs, or all of the programs rather, for Minnesota, for example, the common thread that united all of them, whether it was the Feeding Our Future nonprofit or the Housing Stabilization Services program or whatever it might be, they were federally funded, state administered programs. And as you mentioned before, there is this dangerous incentive misalignment where naturally, if you are spending somebody else's money, you're going to not have the incentive to be judicious with spending or being more careful of where that money is actually going and tracking it to make sure it's going towards its intended beneficiaries. But more importantly, you have the incentive to actually draw more federal dollars to finance these expansions. So naturally, if you have a bunch of money that's going toward waste or it's not going towards it's supposed to be going, you can simply draw more federal dollars to finance that. It's simply not going to be, you're not going to have the incentive to actually run your program effectively. And that's sort of the incentive misalignment problem that the Trump administration really needs to focus on if it comes to tackling this war on fraud. We saw it last month actually with the State of the Union address where he's talking about establishing an anti-fraud task force led by Vice President J.D. Vance. He signed an executive order last week, and he's really talking about he rightly talks about many of the different other problems besides welfare fraud, which is simply one of many different forms of improper payments or other forms of financial abuse that states regularly employ. With Medicaid, for example, we have provider taxes. With SNAP, we have gimmicks like broad-based categorical eligibility, which even allows millionaires to be on food stamps. So there are many different types of gimmicks that states employ, and a lot of this have to do with the incentive misalignment, but also because there are a lack of verification protocols that the Biden administration, in some cases, relaxed or didn't enforce. And so the Trump administration is talking about enforcing these verification protocols, having more federal oversight, which is the right thing to do. And anyone who wants to care about financial responsibility or making sure that money goes towards its intended beneficiaries should want this effort to succeed. But they need to go a step further and tackling the incentive structures and reforming the financing structures for many of these programs. And that can only be done through Congress. And so Congress has to take the lead if Trump wants to win this war on fraud.
Okay, so I know that right now there are big budget battles back and forth in Congress. Um, are the battle lines really clear on this one, or are there people on the political left that say yes, there should be this accountability, and maybe those on the right who are like, no, 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 it's good as it is.
So absolutely. Unfortunately, a lot of the Republicans are talking a big game when it comes to combating welfare fraud. And again, they rightly identify that welfare fraud is a big problem. But when it comes to fixing the structural incentive problems, a lot of the Republicans aren't willing to make that big step toward, for example, block granting Medicaid or devolving SNAP to the states entirely. They do trim around the margins, for example. One of the bills that's going through Congress right now, for example, is restricting states' ability to waive work requirements as discretionary or geographic waivers, for example. That was one that OBBB did. Another one, for example, is having states reducing the quality control threshold because SNAP does not count all improper payments below $58. So we're reducing that to zero so that way all improper payments are counted. So they're trimming around the margins, so to speak, but they're not really taking that big step toward the real cost-saving reforms that are necessary. Unfortunately, Republicans are not taking that step, but the instincts for Republicans are in the right direction in terms of recognizing that it is incentive misalignment. That's why OBBB, for example, imposed matching fund requirements. But when it comes to Democrats, Democrats rightly want to make sure these programs are going toward their intended beneficiaries. But what they recognize is if we devolve these programs toward the states, that's going to significantly reduce funding because states having balanced budget amendments and don't have the deep pockets the federal government has. They recognize that's in many cases going to either force states to eliminate these programs or significantly reduce funding. And naturally, if you want people to be on welfare rolls, if you want people to be covered by the welfare state, you aren't going to want to reduce funding for these programs. You're going to want to increase it. So unfortunately, there is no major movement toward the structural reforms that we need, but there definitely is something that we can jump on when it comes to combating welfare fraud. And that's sort of like the step that we need to take of like, okay, if you want to combat welfare fraud, here's the best way to go about doing it.
And you mentioned in your article the best solution, let the states foot the bill. Talk to me about
Absolutely.
why does that shift the accountability to where someone actually has to answer for how that money is spent?
Absolutely. So devolving these programs over to the states and having the states take full fiscal responsibility for the programs that they choose to operate, not even saying that you should have an unfunded mandate, for example, but if a state chooses to have a food stamp program or a Medicaid or healthcare program, the state should be funding it with state dollars. And the problem that this would solve is it would realign incentives because a state would be closer to constituents, so they'd be able to tailor assistance and beneficiary requirements or verification standards or eligibility protocols, or even what type of benefits you administer. You being closer to constituents know the needs of your constituents a lot better than any federal bureaucrat who is living over on the other side of the country or in DC, who might not know the highly complicated needs of those people you're aiming to serve. But the other thing too is a state would answer directly to its constituents. So state taxpayers who are funding these programs would know exactly who to hold accountable, who to talk to when it comes to these programs wasting their money. So every dollar that a state wastes on a welfare program that goes towards improper payments or it's going towards fraudsters is a dollar that'll be coming directly out of that state's budgets. So they can't simply call on federal taxpayers to have federal taxpayers foot the bill for their poor financial management. So those are the two main problems that full de-evolution would be able to solve. But alternatively, a state could even decide, you know what? I think the best way to go about helping the poor is simply to empower civil society to help with these people, have local charities, churches, and civil society organizations and private charity organizations being able to help these people and deliver aid that is most efficacious. But the key is to allow the state to choose that for themselves.
All right. So I love your idea that look, it's got to start. The states need to take the lead in getting this fraud under control. One last question for you. How does Congress go about putting that ball in the state's court?
So there are many different reforms that Congress can go about doing. So for example, OBBB made the first step with a matching fund requirement. So if you're a state and you have improper payments above 6%, you'd be having to pay for a portion of your SNAP benefits, which is something that never happened before in the program's history. So OBBB, for example, in a second reconciliation bill, can build off of that by having a cost sharing requirement that is not contingent on proper payment rates, and you can increase the cost share gradually year by year of like, okay, starting with say 10% in the first year, then going towards 15 to 20% until eventually you have the states paying 100% of the food stamp programs they opt to fund. With Medicaid, it's a little bit more complicated because it is a $900 billion program between the federal and state governments. But block granting is by far the most politically feasible solution that we have at the current moment. Block granting Medicaid would, one, save taxpayers more than $4 trillion over the course of the next 10 years. It would give states a greater incentive to reduce improper payments and combat fraud because they can't simply rely on more federal dollars to finance the benefit expansions. They wouldn't be able to draw more federal dollars with gimmicks like provider taxes or intergovernmental transfers. So block granting is definitely a great medium-term solution, and we saw the benefits of block grants with the 1996 welfare reforms with TANF, for example. So there is a precedent for more state responsibility and block granting programs to curb federal spending growth and giving the states the autonomy and the responsibility for these programs. And it's important for Congress to recognize there already is a metric and a standard for success that we've already seen, and to be building off of that.
I love it. This is great analysis and I think a very timely topic as well. Again, we're talking with Tyler Turman. He is a Young Voices contributor. Tyler, for those who wish to find and follow you on social media, where can they do that?
Yes, you can follow my Substack at Politics and Praxis, or you can follow me on LinkedIn at Tyler Turman.